Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode of my Musical Moments series, and today we are talking about music written by someone else. And you may say, Bruce, you always talk about music written by someone else. And technically you are correct, that is true, but today we are talking about music that was written by someone other than we thought who wrote it. And I consider it a much more scandalous title, like stolen music, ripped notes. But you know, that seemed a little malicious for what is the story behind most of these cases. And the technical term, misattributed music, that sounded a little academic for the way that I usually present things here, so I went with music written by someone else, and we're talking about some pretty famous composers here, so stick around. So that's right, today we are talking about music that we got a little confused over the course of history about exactly who wrote these things. And we start with one of the biggest names in classical music, good old Wolfie, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He's the one. Have you ever heard his Symphony No. 37? Probably not, because he didn't write it. It turns out that we thought he wrote it for a while, but you know, right after 1900 or so, when historians started looking into this stuff, most of the things that we're talking about today, we figured that out right around that time. Some of them are a little more recent than that, but historians were getting smart enough to look at things and say, wait a minute, that's not really in the style of that composer, and they started really digging into the histories and some of the archives and finding other copies of things. So this is exactly what happened with the case of Mozart's Symphony No. 37, which some authors and historians, they said, you know, this doesn't really seem like it sounds like Mozart that much, but they were like, I guess it is though. And the confusion stems from the fact that Mozart actually did write a little bit of it. So his friend Michael Haydn actually had written the bulk of this symphony. Yes, Haydn is not that super famous Haydn, but his brother. And Michael Haydn's a pretty decent composer. Didn't have the same kind of career that Franz Joseph Haydn had, but certainly a respectable career, and you do hear his music sometimes. But he wrote this piece, a symphony. It was nice, it was perfectly attractive. It was his Symphony No. 25 in that case, and Mozart liked it enough that he actually wrote a little bit of an introduction to this. So Mozart wrote the very, very beginning. That's what you're hearing right now. This actually is Mozart, but once it starts the actual sonata form of the first movement, then you fall into the music of Michael Haydn, and Mozart actually copied it out. So we do know that that's where the confusion initially came from. And so it's a little bit understandable how that particularly happened. And then, but we found a copy of it as Michael Haydn's Symphony No. 25. We found that in an archive somewhere, and people were like, wait, I recognize this. This is Mozart's Symphony No. 37, except it wasn't, because we know this was written first. So that's our first example. Now, sticking with the biggest names in classical music, we move on to our second example. This is good old Lubric van Beethoven. And Beethoven actually had a symphony which you didn't know he wrote because he didn't write it, and that's called the Jena or the Jena Symphony, because this symphony was found in some archives in this small town. It's sort of near Weimar, so a decent-sized community, maybe not small town. But for many, many years, this was thought to be an early effort of Beethoven. You are hearing it right now because we had some records where Beethoven wrote some letters to friends who he said, when I was a student, I worked on a C major symphony before my Symphony No. 1, and I had based some of the ideas in that symphony on Haydn's Symphony No. 97. And the symphony that was found in Jena, that was found in some archives there, it seemed to be very much inspired by that Haydn symphony. And so the person who found it was like, hey, I think this is by Beethoven, published it under Beethoven's name, and some composers and performances even happened where they said, oh, it's this early student work of Beethoven's. Well, then Robbins Landon, who's one of the great historians in the history of the world, he found another copy that was actually signed by the real composer, Friedrich Witt, and that's the guy who wrote this. And so it turns out, a little confusion, honest confusion. Some people say, look, this doesn't sound anything like Beethoven. Why would people think that? But again, retrospect is 2020, so it's easy to go back there and be like, well, you know, of course we could tell, but a lot of those same people were fooled. Now for our next example, we have a music by Albinoni. And I have to admit that the entire inspiration for this particular topic came from a fan. Someone who had seen some of my videos and said, hey, you should do a video about music that was misattributed. Great idea. So here it is, just a couple of weeks later. I hope you are enjoying it, Phil. So anyway, this is music of Albinoni and his famous Adagio in G minor. But you can probably guess, because I think you're on to how this is going to work, he didn't write it. Now this is a beautiful Adagio written for strings and organ in the style of a Baroque Adagio. Really lovely, and this piece is popular. You have definitely heard this in various movie soundtracks, etc. And there is some question, because the person who originally passed this off, actually a historian who says he found this piece initially, his name was Remo Giazotto, an Italian historian, and he wrote some books about other composers, etc. And he was kind of called out, and they said, wait, you said this was by Albinoni. This was not by Albinoni, because it doesn't even sound that Baroque in places. And he said, oh, you're right, but I did find this little piece, a snippet of music of Albinoni's that I adapted into this. Now, we don't actually know if that's true. He may or may not have found that piece. He has not produced definitive evidence that even the little fragment that he found was Albinoni, so we don't know. You can go on YouTube and look up the Albinoni G minor Adagio, and you will find lots of links to performances. It has been recorded a lot under Albinoni's name, wrongly. You can also find some links under the correct composer's name, and I don't know that we'll ever know whether it was based on a fragment or not, or whether it's wholly original and or fake, but we'll see. But as I said, you have heard this piece. It was in the soundtrack to Flashdance, to Rollerball, The Assassination of Gianni Versace, The Doors, and Manchester by the Sea. Those are all movies that use this piece in it. So I don't know about you, I've seen all those movies, so I have heard this piece a lot, and it's one of the most famous of those that we're going to talk about today. Now we have two quick examples, because these go by really, really quickly before I wrap up. And the first of those is Igor Stravinsky. You wouldn't necessarily think there'd be confusion here, but in 1919 he was commissioned to write another ballet. This was on the topic of Pulcinella, the famous Comedy dell'arte character. And Diaghilev went to him and said, hey, I want you to write a ballet on this character and use some music that we found by Pergolesi. This was found in some monastery or something like that. And you know, Stravinsky wasn't that interested in it. He's like, I don't know if I want to do that, but he took a look at the music and he was like, you know, this is kind of interesting, and I could add some rhythmic interesting things and some harmonic interesting things, and so I could probably put my own stamp on it. Sounds like kind of a cool idea, so he writes a 35-minute ballet based on this. Cut to a couple years later, and we find out just what you suspected. That music isn't by Pergolesi at all. It's actually by 4 or 5 different composers. There's a couple of people who wrote more of it than others. It's still a really charming and really interesting work. You're listening to a little bit of that right now, of course. And one of my favorite pieces, I've actually done this, of Stravinsky's, and it works really effectively in concert. And it was all not for naught, because it did kick off Stravinsky's neoclassical period. We've talked about that in a couple of different videos. You know, Stravinsky had these 3 periods, and this whole middle period was known as his neoclassical period. And such wonderful music came from this, including, of course, the Dumbarton Oaks, which we did a performance of, COVID-inspired performance of, with the Sequoia Symphony, but also this piece. So there's some really wonderful things that came out of this, even if there was a little confusion over who actually wrote the Pergolesi music in it. And then the other quick example is good old Brahms. That's right, this happened to Brahms, and you may have heard one of the first variations for orchestra, which is his variations on a theme of Haydn. Guess what? Haydn didn't write that. That's right, we don't actually know who wrote this theme, but it turns out this was called the St. Anthony Chorale. And many performances of this today don't actually say variations on a theme by Haydn. They'll actually frame it as variations on this St. Anthony Chorale. Some use both titles just because the work was pretty well known in its form when it was called Variations on a Theme by Haydn. It's kind of an unusual theme because it's in 5-bar phrases. You don't hear that all the time. And a little bit groundbreaking for its time because it was really one of the only standalone variations for full orchestra that was ever written, and a really, really charming work, just not by Haydn in this particular case. And we do know, though, how this happened, and that Brahms found it. Haydn's name was on it. And in this case, we know that the name that was put on it was put there by a publisher because they thought, wow, I can sell a lot more of these if I have Haydn's name on it. So that really does qualify a bit for stolen, because they're like, well, nobody's going to buy this if I just call it St. Anthony Chorale, but what if I just put Haydn's name on it? I'll sell a lot that way. Kind of clever, I suppose, for the time, but created some confusion, of course, when Brahms eventually found it. He figured it was by Haydn because it said it was by Haydn. So an honest mistake on Brahms' part, not such an honest mistake on the original publisher's part, who published the chorale. And for our last example today, allegedly, we have the only true criminal in the story today. Now, again, I say allegedly because I don't know. I haven't done all the personal research myself. Googling, I don't know about you, I do not consider Googling to be definitive research, but allegedly this person may actually be a little bit of a criminal, and this is Henri Casadesus. Henri Casadesus, who was a Frenchman, he was a violist, and with a couple of friends, including Sasson, they started a quartet, or a performance group, actually, with Sasson, and it was called the Society of Ancient Instruments, and they performed music, especially music that was written for instruments which were no longer played all that much. So the viola da gamba, the viola d'amore, actually Casadesus played that himself, and so they performed music for these instruments that are really not used that often, so sort of like archaic instruments, if you will. And they presented several discoveries of music for these particular instruments, and particularly viola concertos. Casadesus was a violist, and so he presented a C.P.E. Bach viola concerto, a J.C. Bach viola concerto, and his most famous, a concerto by Handel. So there is a Handel / Casadesus viola concerto, which actually is a pretty good piece, and you hear violists study this piece because it's a great work for them to grow and develop on their instrument, and pretty satisfying in performance. So it's kind of a two-edged sword there, because it's sometimes decent music, but just not written by the composers that they said it was written by. But they figured I could get a lot more play out of this if I say that it's by C.P.E. Bach, J.C. Bach, both sons of J.S. Bach. The Adelaide Concerto by Mozart, same thing, and I believe there's a Boccherini, actually, violin concerto, which they said was by Boccherini, but actually written by himself. His brother also wrote some of these pieces too, so the two of them were writing music and knowingly, allegedly, passing this music off by other people. So, again, my last example, maybe the only devious example that we have, and maybe that would qualify under my title of stolen music. But the rest of these, I think, pretty honest mistakes, but kind of interesting the way we know about misattributed works here, and kind of fun to talk about those. So if you have not done so already, there is a like button below, please click like, and if you have not done so already, there's a subscribe button below, please click subscribe, and we will have more music very, very soon to share with you. Thanks for joining us today. Take care.